Good morning, all, and welcome to our first CFC Media Lab webinar. So before I begin, just a few housekeeping notes, okay? So first of all, this is a webinar format. So what that means is that you will only see the panelists in view, as well as whatever slides that we have. There's actually quite a few participants in the room. There's about over 60 of you listening in. Hello, and you come from all sorts of places, but are most definitely well known to us as part of the CFC Media Lab community. So first, it's a webinar format. You're all muted, your videos are all off. The panelists will have their videos on and their mics on, and we'll be speaking with each other. Second thing is the chat is disabled. And the reason for that is so that the panelists and the wonderful tech support people and folks behind the scenes can troubleshoot in real time. What we do have for you is the Q&A bar, which is at the bottom. So if you look below on your screen, you'll see participants, or you might not see participants, but you'll see Q&A, and that is the place where you can actually ask for questions. And I already see that there's a few of you that's asking all sorts of things right now. So hopefully Megan Byrne can see stuff now. Maybe Megan, you can type your answer and make sure that you can, and a whole load of folks can see it. But those questions will be answered in real time. So make sure that you just keep putting your questions below there. All right. And what else? And this is an hour and a half long. Oh yeah, the other thing that in terms of housekeeping is that this is a very meaty conversation. And so we expect that we're not going to get through all the things that we're supposed to be talking about. And so it's important for us to be okay with that. And so your questions will be copied, and we will make sure we get to answer all those questions, either by extending this webinar into a part 2. So we've already earmarked next Friday for that, or sending you the responses to the emails. Okay, so those are the housekeeping. So now we can begin. Welcome, everyone. I hope you and your families and your communities are doing well. This is quite a nerve-wracking time for all of us, and certainly I'm feeling a little bit hesitant and weird here in this sort of bubble of cyberspace that we're in. And I think what's important is to remember that we are a community trying to figure this stuff out together. And ironically enough, although we are in these sort of very contained cyberspace bubbles, I've never felt the need to be more grounded than ever, and to remember that we are on this land together. So I do want to acknowledge that despite the fact that we're in virtual, I very much want to acknowledge that we are also stewarding this space, this place that we're in, and we're part of that. And I want to acknowledge that this land, this dish with one spoon treaty land that we're in, is something that feels even more sort of a necessary grounding, at least for me and hopefully for many of you there, and has been home to many of the peoples, indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And together, and then you know, more of us are coming, and together let's shepherd this. And so part of this shepherding of this and grounding ourselves is really to not just ground us in place, but to ground us in our current time. And so today's talk is really going to be about sharing with you how we at CFC Media Lab has been thinking about what this present moment means, and what it's about, and how to think about it, and how to contextualize it, so that we can more imaginatively and transformatively move towards a future that we're going to co-create together. And the process that we're using to do that work is called scenario planning. And this looks at evidence-based research and expert analysis, and really looking at it with some realistic lenses in mind to try to see how we can situate our current moment in a grounded way and in a realistic way, and hopefully help us make some of the decisions we need to make. Because many of you here, and here now are over 70, you know, you're either founders of companies, you're either business owners that have businesses for a long time, you're content creators, you're entrepreneurs. And although there's a lot that you can do, and we will help you with that in terms of the immediate moment of what you should do next, et cetera, we also know that it's important that you start to think about how to start planning in a more long-term fashion. So without further ado, the way this whole thing is going to work is Erin, who has been largely shepherding a lot of this thinking around scenario planning along with myself, will first, maybe we can go into gallery view. Can we do that? Joseph, thanks. Is it happening? Can someone go yes or no? No. Erin, is it happening yet? Gallery view? Okay. So Erin and I will first talk about the scenarios, and then we have experts, Susan Bondy, Karim Bardeesy, and Erin Millar, who will sort of stress test that stuff as we, the scenarios that we have proposed, and talk about it from each of their points of view. So can we go into gallery view for a second there, Joseph? And can you please unmute Erin and unmute all of our panelists, maybe Joseph, if that's okay, so we can just make some intros.
I think I'm unmuted.
Oh, there, you're unmuted. Okay, great. So maybe first I'll call your name, and then if each of you could just introduce yourself briefly. So Erin, do you want to start?
Yeah, Erin Williamson, founder of a strategy consultancy here in Toronto called Goal 17.
Great. And Susan?
Hi, I'm a professor of epidemiology at the University of Toronto at Dalla School of Public Health.
And Erin, who's with us all the way from Vancouver. Erin, good morning.
Good morning. My face will brighten as the sun comes up over here in Vancouver. I'm Erin Millar. I'm the founder and CEO of the Discourse, so representing a founder's view.
Great. And Karim, are you unmuted, Karim? Not yet. Joseph, could you please unmute Karim as well?
Hi, thanks so much, Anna, and the rest of you. My name is Karim Bardeesy. I'm the I run the Ryerson Leadership Lab, which is an action-oriented think tank at Ryerson, working at the intersection of leadership and public policy. And I worked in government for 9 years for Premiers Kathleen Wynne, Dalton McGuinty, and Minister of Finance.
Great. Okay, so let's get started. Oh, it's me, right? I'm the one that has to share. So let me just pull up the sharing thing. I'm gonna continue and go into here and share this and do full screen mode. Okay, and I'm gonna go to the next slide, Erin.
Right, I still have the first slide up, but maybe while that's coming up, I'll just start by saying that we started having conversations early last week, and as kind of school closures came in and the seriousness of this started to become more public. And I think top of mind for us was thinking through what does this mean for us in terms of planning, and how do we know what's going to come next with enough certainty that we can really start to put some plans in place, but more importantly, for all of the companies that are a part of this can start to think through in kind of realistic terms what the best strategies might be going forward. for context, I was looking back at some of the numbers historically because things are changing so quickly that really understanding what is happening is changing very quickly. So middle of last week, March 15th, there were only 400 cases in the US. There were 180,000 cases globally. And also importantly, last week, March 16th, a study came out of Imperial College in London on, they called it the impact of non-pharmaceutical interventions to reduce COVID-19 mortality and healthcare demand. This study is quietly credited with changing some of the US administration's thinking on the seriousness of the pandemic. So at that point, when we started talking about how to create some scenarios around this and really start to create a planning frame going forward, the most important step in creating planning scenarios is to really understand what are the variables that are in play that are going to dramatically shift the operating environment that we're in. And so our first conversations within the context of last week were, what are those variables that are going to determine how long this is going to go for, how serious it's going to get, and therefore what we need to do in response. The variables at the time that seemed most pertinent, first of all, you remember, for those of you that are parents, we had the announcement that March break was going to have an extra 2 weeks on it. And as you started to see suggestions of social distancing measures coming in, and we saw them come in much more forcefully in Italy and in other jurisdictions, the first variable seemed to be duration and intensity of policy response. What were governments going to do in a kind of a centralized and coordinated way to answer the calls of public health professionals in terms of how to manage this? And we could imagine this being kind of from an extreme on the far left. You hear about countries like Mexico where absolutely nothing is being done. And on the far right, countries like Italy where shelter in place and very strict measures are locking people down. And so that seemed to be the first dimension of this. And obviously a question of that is not just the intensity and severity of those measures, but also importantly for all of us, the duration of those measures. The other variable that we thought was the most important at the time was virus persistence. We can all remember things like the SARS crisis that were incredibly scary at the time, seemed to represent a very significant risk, but very quickly were managed and put down and controlled. And then you hear about things like the 1918 flu that can reach a huge percentage of the global population with a very significant death toll. And so the other dimension here was, what is the virus going to do? Is this something that is going to completely peter out or be managed, or is this something that's going to go to full spread? So with these two dimensions, we ended up with a kind of 2x2 graph that allowed us to plan out 4 kind of scenarios. And I think it's important to realize that all of these represent a spectrum, that the scenarios we've created are at the extremes, and the most likely thing is going to be somewhere in between those, but these kind of allow us to model out some different instances. So I'll say on the right side of the graph, where we have, let's say, low persistence of the virus, but a very intense policy response, we have a scenario we called turning tide. And this is a scenario in which really heavy early intervention, as we're seeing in a lot of countries, manages the spread of the virus. And also there could be some breakthroughs in treatment and the ways that we're managing the virus, that potentially this turns it around pretty quickly. Quick in that sense, though, still meant 6 months, because part of that is about keeping transmissions low enough so that it doesn't overwhelm our health system. So kind of that quick turning tide we still saw as 6 months of heavy disruption in terms of everyday life, being able to move and travel and have kind of predictability in our days. On the top right of that, we saw the one we were calling rolling blackout. This is one where there are heavy measures. As we're seeing, there's travel restrictions, there's shelter in place. This is not going to be constant, but it's going to kind of repeat over time as there are many outbreaks over time, which means there's going to be kind of constant disruption as there's kind of an ebb and flow of the virus. And this is something that we could see happening over the course of 18 months, these disruptions, while they wouldn't be continuous, we would see these kinds of disruptions kind of on and off over 18 months.
And
So on that side, yes.
I just want to add, as Erin said, these are extremes. So when this scenario description was written with, service sector wiped out, et cetera, obviously it's not going to wipe out the entire thing. So I just don't want anyone to be alarmed by some of the language that have been used. We were trying to figure out how to reflect the extremity position. And because, as Erin did say, this is the most extreme sort of spaces, but it's all the middle smaller dots that you see there is where we think things are going to go. So sorry to interrupt there, Erin.
Yeah, it's good. It's good to keep me from swinging to the extremes, Anna. Thank you. We saw on the left side, we modeled out 2 scenarios in which it was looking at low to no centralized policy responses. So you can see already there's kind of discourse emerging, especially south of the border, in terms of really weighing the economic impacts of these public health measures. And there is kind of pressure in some circles to not do anything at all. Or in some jurisdictions, it might just be that there's not a capacity, and so there's not an effort being put in that sense. We called this one free for all, in which we would imagine would kind of create an environment of prevailing fear, in which there's knowledge of the spread, there's knowledge of the impacts, health impacts of the spread, but without kind of the centralized tools and cover to do anything about it. So in terms of people being able to leave work, it would be kind of the privilege of those who could, but for the rest of us would still have to show up. There wouldn't be kind of centralized measures on what to do. On the bottom part with low persistence and kind of not an intense policy response is, we called the big fizzle, is that this turned out to be a democratic conspiracy, as we heard, and this was kind of much ado about nothing. And despite our fears, it just went away. And although there would be some kind of initial impacts that we've already seen in terms of jobless rates and layoffs, deep economic impacts wouldn't really.
Okay, so Erin hung up there.
And people kind of get back to work.
Great.
So those were the 4. And
Yeah, since
I guess we did these as a first hypothesis or set of hypotheses to kind of test and to see, do these seem like the most likely frames that we can plan within? So, and I turn it over there.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks for that. And I'm sorry that we can't do more back and forth with participants, but I said, please do use that Q&A box for any questions that you might have sort of with these scenarios. So the first thing we obviously wanted to test against the experts, and we have them right here on the right here, is do we have the right sort of framing of what this virus is about? Neither Erin or I are epidemiologists, so we thought it was important to actually do the stress test with Susan. So Sue, maybe we can hand it over to you. You know, as an epidemiologist, are these likely scenarios, the bottom 2, vis-a-vis the persistence of this virus, or the virality of the virus?
Okay, so I think it's really impressive the degree to which you guys have tucked into this literature and are understanding the research on epidemic and pandemics. And this literature goes on all the time in between when there isn't an outbreak, and people have reports of science where they forecast what viruses will do. And there are scientists who've been anticipating the next big pandemic flu sort of all the time when the rest of the public is not paying attention to it. And so those people were looking at this outbreak really early on and looking at the entire forecast funnel of it's going to contain itself very quickly to going totally pandemic and endemic, and the whole thing. When they're farther out, all possibilities are open. And as time goes on, certain scenarios are just no longer plausible. We're looking at a specific band of possibilities. It is clear now that the pandemic will not simply resolve very quickly. Every country with a developed public health system hoped for, and is still hoping for, what we call containment, that eventually we would, through social distancing and other measures and contact tracing, every time the first cases came up, they rigorous contact tracing, try to isolate people, to put a little bubble around the infections and stop them from spreading. Every jurisdiction wanted that to happen. Nobody said we don't want that as an outcome, but that ship has sailed. Most countries have moved past that phase of the pandemic where they believe that containment is likely. We did see it in China with extreme controls on movement and the economy and borders being closed, and a really, really aggressive response. But there are so many other countries now that have outbreaks that's not going to happen in most places in the short time window of a 3-month period. So that ship has sailed. The other one is, could Canada right now move from the social distancing that they have now to an even more severe shutdown where the economy is halted? And the answer is no, because Canada is a democratic polity, and we are not going to sustain completely shutting down the economy in order to pull off the draconian measures that would have to be put in place to stop this thing within 6 months. What is most likely is that we're going to see that there will be some part of the world that still has active infection, and we are still going to have a big proportion of the Canadian population who are not yet immune. And we're going to see reintroduction of cases and continued spread in the community. One of the things that's particularly interesting about this bug is that this one can be spread by people who are not symptomatic, and that makes it extremely difficult to control. And we have, in this window in March, we have millions of people returning from outside of Canada with not knowing that they have infections, and they're able to pass it from person to person before we know about it. So both of those sort of wrapping it up quite quickly scenarios, either because it's going to be easy to contain or because of draconian measures, neither of those are going to happen in a very short period of time. We're going to be with this for a while.
Great, thanks, Sue. Karim, do you want to weigh in on that? We had a question from Sarah Diamond about centralized versus decentralized policies, public responses. Sue kind of alluded to that as a Western nation, we're not likely to enact draconian measures, but maybe you can speak to that a little bit. I think he needs to get unmuted, Joseph, or host, if someone could do that.
Sorry, do you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks, and that was a really good, these are really good things from which I can make a few comments. So Sue mentioned the preparation that epidemiologists and public health types make for this kind of situation. And I would just add and observe that economic policy and other public policy types generally have not, to my experience, done that kind of participation, nor have the epidemiologists been in conversation with public policy and economic types, or vice versa, around how to prepare. So on occasion you'll get kind of shock simulations that people in government or others will prepare for, terrorist attacks, other major disruptions of public life. But I'm not aware of one that was really done. I'm not aware of a simulation or a preparation event that was ever done that related in any way to what we're now experiencing. And that's why I think one of the reasons you're seeing the economic policy and social policy side kind of, it looks like they're catching up. It's because frankly they are. And they're really depending a lot on the public health systems to be doing that, all that urgent work that we know is happening. So that's just one observation, that the solutions you're seeing are being made up a bit on the fly. It's unprecedented, but we also don't have the systems necessarily in place to bring surge capacity quickly to people who need it, just as is in the case in the health system. The health system we run more or less at capacity. The economic and social supports that we have either run at capacity or above capacity, or we have these ways of getting money to people, but they're not perfect. So we know, and there may be people on this call who are receiving or applying for benefits, and those are going to take some time, or they're based on older information. So one of the things this situation is exposing is that fracture in our kind of social solidarity net, that a shock event like this actually overwhelms it and requires a different set of resources. And so one of the reasons you're hearing about a basic income as an idea that seems to be very present now and has lots of people of all political perspectives saying, at least as a temporary measure, we need it, is because it's a vehicle through which in an emergency you can act quickly. So I'll just say that on the modeling that Sue had mentioned versus the relative lack of modeling in economic circles. A bit later, I might show the most shocking, one of the most shocking stats of all is the weekly unemployment claims being made in Canada and the US. And the New York Times homepage put the weekly claims on their front page yesterday, and it was literally off the chart. They couldn't build a chart that was big enough to show how high it had spiked compared to the historic averages. I just want to say, I'll get to Sarah's question in a moment, but I want to say one more thing about the construct that Erin's put here, and I can speak to I guess the x-axis, the duration and intensity of policy response. One thing we have not seen yet, and this is the reason why, as heinous as Donald Trump's comments are about Easter, coming back at Easter with a sense of optimism, has no sense of reality. He is speaking for a constituency, and it's not just the constituency of the profiteers and the cheerleaders and the right-wing populists. He's actually speaking for a lot of those people who want some sense of how the health side relates to the economic side. And so what we don't yet have real guidance on yet, and this is where the health policy people and the rest of the policy people have to come together, is, okay, we have these measures in place now. Draw it out for us a little while. What are appropriate measures that the public health community could endorse that would result in some return of economic activity? I don't think you've seen that yet. In fact, you're seeing the dialogue happening in public between the health people and the economic people. And I am hoping that one of the things that governments do, because both places end up in government in many ways, the public health side and the economic policy side, is that they start to host those conversations internally that result in some form of prediction on the duration and intensity of policy response on that x-axis, what that looks like a bit more, because right now we have very little guidance. We basically have a guidance to pause economic activity with the exception of this list, and the list is to one of the parts of Sarah's point, sort of depends on the jurisdiction. So
can I say a word to that? And Karim, can I jump in for one moment?
Yeah.
Because I think that for us was an underpinning question in all of this, in the absence of that guidance. And I myself am a business owner. I had my kind of March, April revenue go down by about 90%. My overheads stayed fixed, but not my revenue. So my immediate question is, so in the absence of anything other than fantastical promises by people like Trump, I'm not hearing anything on timelines. And I would say also, as we tried to put this in place so I could at least start to plan whether I'm just doing a temporary pause or am I really shifting for a new normal. We had our first conversation with Sue last week, testing this model. And my takeaway from that conversation was we actually got our model wrong. Because our vertical axis here, the virus persistence, doesn't seem to be a variable. So we're now talking, one of our axes seems to be something that's variable and we need to figure out. The other one is wrong. And so I don't know, Anna, if we want to turn it to Sue to say why we're wrong.
Well, before I turn to Sue, this has to do with a third question. So I'm jumping around the question. So Megan Byrne asked the question around the service sector and how it will be affected despite rent and utility freezes, and that has a specific correlation to this notion of timelines, right? And so maybe we can just talk to Sue a little bit on what are we talking about, and how for how long should people be planning?
Okay, so the modelers are working furiously in Canada as anywhere else in the world. In fact, watch this space. I'm trying not to look at my cell phone because some modeling reports that are being done out of my university are emerging, and glancing at it, the word marathon caught my eye. And I'm like, so we are talking about a long period of time before we stop having active cases in the world that could be reappearing in Canada. So we're going to continue to have new diagnosed cases for some time. And we're going to have a lag behind that of all the time it takes to wash ill people through the strained healthcare system. So we're going to see a lot worse impact on the healthcare system over the next few months than we are seeing right now. And it's going to be a long time before we stop have a risk of a return of epidemics, so new outbreaks happening. Then even if you look back at the experience of SARS, which the epidemiologists and the business people in the healthcare system in Ontario in particular were very attuned to, and it did change our behavior. It did change what we think about when times are good. It changed people's behavior about infection control concern for some time. And so I think it's going to, even if it looks as though we're turning the tide on this epidemic, it's going to be a long time before people feel comfortable going out to large events and things. So behavior change will last
so
even after the virus does.
The
consumer behavior is one part of it. Yeah, and it's affecting different sectors very differently. People, different age groups differ enormously in terms of their risk. And so their different age groups will differ very much in terms of their willingness to engage in, say, large public events. And there are differences in humans' perception of risk. So people will behave differently for the same, factual risk in the newspapers. People will conduct themselves differently. So it's going to affect some sectors very differently from others, but a long term is what we're looking at.
Okay, thank you for that. Erin, because we do have, as Erin Williamson alluded to, based on our conversation with Sue, we do have an evolved version of this matrix, which we will show you. But before we go to that secondary matrix that we developed, I just want to bring it up with Erin, who is a founder of Discourse. When you see this first matrix, like what's your first, Sue told us, hey, the bottom two, that doesn't work for me. There's no such thing as 3 months, 6 months. Karim has said to us, yes, this is kind of a difficulty around how to plan for this duration and intensity of policy response, because policy response is being developed in real time, essentially. And we need more kind of integration between the public health officials and the economic policy people to try to determine what are the options. And it can't just be like, rent freezes forever, right? So so when you hear that, Erin, what do you think as a business owner, and how does this make you feel?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a couple days ago where I started realizing that this wasn't just something that was going to last for 2 months. And I think I've been talking to a lot of different business owners. I'm involved in a in addition to, you know, my own business and my husband has a brewery. I run a digital news media company. My brother-in-law has a restaurant. In addition to all that, I've also been part of this, starting this movement called Save Small Business, which is really about Main Street type businesses that are the retail, all of that kind of more brick and mortar type businesses that are like actually closed right now. They just have no operations, but their expenses continue, as Erin said. And what I'm hearing a lot from people is that they're thinking about this as a temporary interruption of business. They're thinking, how can I manage my financing so I don't go bankrupt in 2 months? And so I can, you know, continue at the end of 2 months. And a lot of the advocacy around how to support business has been focused on that. How can we, you know, we have either been forced to or chosen to stop our businesses during this period of time for the public good to save lives. How do we also pause or stop our expenses during this time? How do we stop time economically? And that's where we're hearing the calls for rent relief, or we're hearing the calls for pausing interest payments, those sorts of things. What I don't, and I do absolutely think those things are necessary for this short-term shock to allow people the space, even if only the mental space, to be able to think creatively. But that's not, you know, that's not going to actually be the medium-term solution. As you know, you've all laid out here very clearly, like this isn't something that's going to go away in 2 or 3 months. And so what I'm thinking about as a business owner is, with my own company, is how do I build a resilient organization that creates value in this new circumstance, that finds ways to monetize that value, but also how do I build my organization in a way that it is more flexible and resilient from a cash perspective, to be able to lean in and lean back appropriately in how we're creating value throughout this rolling blackout type scenario, which is the one that I've been thinking more and more about, and seems to me to be the most likely. So, I mean, I can be more specific about that, Anna, if you'd like, but maybe I'll just pause there. And,
yeah, let's pause that for the next scenario. But specifically, Petra has been asking to, you know, if we could specifically focus also, because you're one of them, on how this particular crisis also affects women entrepreneurs, in specifically, because we have many of our participants in Fifth Wave on this call as well. So maybe you could speak to them as well.
Yeah, for sure. That's I'm also involved in the CEO network of women supporting women-led businesses. And, you know, one of my big concerns about the impact of the COVID economic crisis on our economy is that we've been doing all of this work to try to create a more equitable circumstances in which women can found businesses. You know, the government has invested quite a lot of money into that in the last, government has been focused on that. We've had the Women's Entrepreneurship Fund, a number of different things. Of course, Fifth Wave, CEO, all of these things have come up in the last 5 years, and that has really moved things forward, at least in terms of the perception that there is a way to start a business and scale an ambitious business. We still haven't moved the needle in a really significant way on access to capital. It's still a single-digit number. We hear 4% thrown around a lot in terms of the amount of venture capital that goes towards women-founded businesses. So in general, women-led businesses are more undercapitalized than others. And so in terms of how do we make our businesses resilient and have a cash reserve to be able to have the space to innovate and adapt and be adaptable through this rolling blackout period, the businesses that are the least capitalized are going to be those that are most vulnerable in that position. And so, and you could look at this in lots of different ways, but generally when there's a big crisis like this, the most vulnerable in our society are most impacted. And we're definitely going to see where there is systemic discrimination within our financing system and within our economic system, that is hugely amplified during this period of crisis. And so, I've been very focused on how we can ensure that the most vulnerable businesses are receiving the support that they need, not only sort of across the board solutions for everyone, but also targeted support for those companies that are most vulnerable.
Thanks for that. And in fact, Caitlin Troughton in our Q&A said, would love to see more pressure put on the banks to provide relief so that members in society is not carrying the lion's share of the burden. So, the kind of targeted relief that we can point banks to, although I know credit is not necessarily what you're looking for more of.
Yeah, can I just speak to that too, Anna? Sure. So some of the work, there's actually, today is the day that we're going to see a lot more pressure on banks coming up, from what I'm hearing from what people are sort of planning in terms of media and open letters and things like that. So I think we're going to start to see that story today. And just yesterday, Trudeau, made some more aggressive calls to banks around credit card debt, for example. And I think we'll start to see that amplify as more stories come out of people being rejected for mortgage deferrals and that kind of thing. So I'm hopeful that we'll get to that. But yeah, my view on it is that, just when we're thinking about who, essentially our entire society has decided that we need to take this economic act to make this, take these collective actions to respond to the COVID threat and save lives. However, the way that our economy is set up right now, the business owners are actually, they've already lost all of their revenues, but they're actually now positioned in terms of if debt is the solution to holding them alive, then what we're asking them to take on a disproportionate amount of the risk during this period. And so I think we need solutions that are about equitably sharing that risk and that impact across the whole value chain, the real estate value chain. And absolutely banks, they're still, everybody has been told that they have to close their restaurants, but the banks are still charging interest. They're acting as if it's business as usual, even though it is not business as usual. So we're going to get to that breaking point, I hope, and we start to see some real change.
Yeah. Well, this is a good time to, I think, go to our next model, because our next model suggests that in order for us to actually get somewhere, everyone has to do their share. So I'm just going to go through, and Sue, because you've spoken to your slides, we're just going to go through these because I don't think it's necessary to go through them now, right?
Agreed.
Okay, there we go. So Erin.
So we were a little thrown last week when we realized that our first graph was wrong. So thanks, Sue. It happens on first contact with facts and research. And so then the question was, as we heard with Erin just now, and Karim alluded to as well, is there has to be another dimension. What are the other variables that we're playing with here? And the duration intensity of policy response remains a significant factor in all of this. The other dimension that emerged for us as we continued our inquiry on this is around this idea of resilience and adaptation. And so Erin has given a number of examples of this already. Is really the way we conceived of this dimension is kind of to what degree do we reframe individual and collective norms and responsibilities? Do we keep things kind of business as usual, economy as usual? What's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. You owe me interest, we have a contract, nothing changes. Or in both our kind of individual businesses, in our communities, and in our government policies, and in our economic policy, is there an evolution? Is there some broader adaptation and reframing of those collective responsibilities that happen? So when we essentially sliced our last graph in half and took out the bottom part of it, the two scenarios, the rolling blackout and the free-for-all, remained as possibilities, but they kind of dropped to the bottom of, look, this is what happens if we don't adapt. We just shut it down. We just kind of weather this, but there's no renegotiation of what my responsibility is to my employees or what the bank's responsibility is to society. That just stays the same in those bottom two scenarios. What we imagine then in terms of this conversation around adaptation, which is where we've been turning our thinking, and we're hoping people here can turn their thinking as well, is what are those changes that we need to make in terms of how we're running our businesses, in terms of how we're rethinking the business itself? Erin mentioned kind of shifting to a more resilient structure. And so the two sides of that graph, the top right and the top left, really is a spectrum of to what degree are these whole of society conversations in which government is central in that conversation. Karim mentioned things like universal basic income coming back as a possibility. Is this something that we kind of have a new social contract among all of us? Or on the kind of far left, is this something that is really the kind of government is out of ideas? They're paralyzed, whether by partisanship, lack of unity. You saw in the United States a kind of a row in the Senate over how little you can get away with paying workers who are laid off. Does that paralysis take over? And therefore, is this renegotiation of these responsibilities something that happens at a community level, at a organizational level, at a company level? Is this kind of put forward by civil society that we kind of on a grassroots level take control of how we adapt within this situation? So I will leave it there again, Anna, but this was kind of the evolution of the graph when we realized that kind of virulence was no longer the dimension that we were controlling for, that this really was about, at this point, the virus is doing what it's doing. This is all about how we respond.
And this is a big ask for everyone because it moves us away from, you know, pay for my rent, pay for my utilities, pay for my the employees that I have to let go, which, as Erin said, are important things to do in the short term, but really then starts to move us into a direction of how do I reimagine everything that I'm doing, you know? So maybe Karim will turn back to you. Oh, go ahead,
Actually,
Erin.
one thing, Anna, that I was thinking we kind of went over Sue's slides, but I think one thing that might kind of jump out for people when you look at this is that top right one, we're talking about 24 months. And yes,
Is it
this
that
slide,
one? Yeah.
I just maybe, Sue, if you can tell us what we're looking at here.
So this particular graph is a mathematical simulation, but what it shows is the phenomenon that every time when you have a pandemic or a really big epidemic and it hasn't been wiped out, you tend to have rebound outbreaks. The whole population will not be immune for months to months. And so somewhere in the world, there will be another infectious person who can suddenly pop up or we'll find one. So you can expect to have, not necessarily this predictable, but you can expect to have new outbreaks happen, at least in some part of the country, and put a new terror into people. And so behavior will change again. And so we're looking at a long term until such time as a vaccine can be manufactured and put out on an annual basis, like the flu vaccine is one possibility. So the timeline here is not known. The periodicity of this is not going to be that predictable, but we don't know when there will be return outbreaks, but we know that there will be, because that's what these viruses do. Right. So it's going to be a longer term adaptation, and people are going to be changing their behavior and being vigilant with the risk of being shut down on short notice. The people who did this graph actually were also experimenting with a number of very different kinds of restrictions. And so it won't be just a one flavor on and off switch, but there's a whole series of layers of different restrictions are being examined for their potential benefits, such as isolating mostly seniors, which is unique to this epidemic, but it seems it's also affecting young people, only large events and easing up on small things. A number of different policy measures are being discussed, and basic income, childcare, ability to work, debt, those are public health outcomes too, and inequitable harm is something that very, very proud of our Canadian policymakers. They compared on a world scale because they are aware of the impact of social equity, and I think motivated to come up with some solutions. It's just that those solutions are really hard.
Mm-hmm. Which is great to turn back to Karim on this, because I'd love to hear your thoughts now on
Yeah, well,
the hardness of the policy solutions.
Sure. And if for what it's worth, I wrote a blog post last week about the need for every institution and every leader needs to look within and ask themselves some pretty tough questions, even if they're not on the front lines of this fight, and needs to look within at what sacrifices, what they're going to do for the broader good. I would note that something that sometimes happens, I mean, this is a common thing, and anyone who's a sports fan or you know, follows military history or other things probably knows that, like, so often you think of the things that you used to win the last time and the analogies that we have out there, the completely wrong analogies that we have out there in general to the 2008-2009 financial crisis are being used as, the resiliency and the strength of the financial Canadian banking system in 2008 and 2009, which helped us then, are the exact things that we cannot have now, that are things that are limiting us now. I don't want to get into the finances of anyone on the call, but I'm sure Erin would have something to say about the connectivity of big banks to existing small business versus connectivity of credit unions or others, and the fact that a lot of small businesses actually aren't that connected to the financial system to begin with. So because, and I think we need to see some more data on that, but the bigness and the small number of Canadian banks right now is holding us back rather than enabling us. And I think that's just something that probably needs some fleshing out with data. And I'm glad to hear that Erin and others are working on a campaign on that. So that's sorry, I don't know if that's the observation you were looking for, but I did want to pick up on that one because I think it's an important one to look at. And I think it's important for communities like the ones that people are connected into here, figure out how they're going to bring together data, stories, bring their data, bring their stories, and bring their collective action together to act in this space. Because again, we're in for a long period. Sue showed the episodic nature to us, and absent some more specific policy around how we're going to deal with it, there's going to be a real freeze in a lot of service sector and a lot of small business for a while. And the deferral, I'll also make one other piece of policy advice or something to watch for in the media. Anytime any entity counts up deferrals as the money it's contributing to the solution, just be wary. So the federal government announced wasn't that long, an $82 billion package, but it was 1/3 money and 2/3 deferrals. Mm-hmm. Deferrals still need to get paid in the end. And this isn't we're not in a Jubilee year setting yet where all debts need to be forgiven, but deferrals aren't going to help a lot, especially if interest is being charged against them, as referred to earlier. And that's for what, there's another reason that deferrals may not help as much as the money that's being touted against them would suggest, which is the following. We haven't really talked about it yet in the call, but the economic structures, the landscape is going to be completely different. Businesses that go away aren't going to be able to just come back. Businesses that hang on are not going to be able necessarily to just return to where they were pre-virus. Whole sectors, whole parts of the economy are going to change, and it's very hard to predict what those things are, but we can predict that with some certainty.
Well, this is partially why we moved into a more hopeful sort of matrix. I actually see this as a hopeful matrix in that, there is, if change is the only thing that is fixed, in the same way that the virus, the persistence of the virus is also fixed, then how we change, what actually changes, is potentially under a control. So that whole notion of what is this new social contract is really up to the various collectives to try to push for. And yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, and can I just say, there's actually, there's weirdly an opportunity for more agency now, because things that a lot of people used to believe to be true, they're not necessarily willing to believe those things anymore. And that creates opportunities for action, because people, collectivities can engage in more persuasion. They can bring on more people to their cause. People are more persuadable. There's all kinds of opportunities. People are responding to information in different ways. They're not as, they might be unhooked from the institution that they thought was there for them, and they might glom on to and connect with other communities and other data points and stories and action opportunities that can, for those who do have a vision of what the future needs to look like, there's going to be a willingness to hook onto that. I mean, the last version of that we had, of the last kind of mass gathering of, one of the last mass gatherings of the dispossessed was Occupy, the Occupy movement. But they didn't have a solution. Here we can imagine the creation of solutions in that new social contract bubble, let's say, that could be really promising, as tough as it is now.
Yeah, Erin, I know you're chomping at the bit to answer that.
I'm like, keep turning off my mute so that you'll see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to build on what Karim said, which I find really inspiring. And actually, when you guys showed me these scenarios yesterday, I found it really calming. I've been for the last 2 weeks, like some people, when I see people tweeting about how, oh, this relaxing time that we can meditate at home and reconnect with friends. I'm like, what? Aren't you like sprinting like everyone else trying to save? Like, don't you realize what's happening here?
You can do both, Erin. You can do both.
Sorry, I'm not there yet. I'm getting there because I'm going to burn out soon. But anyhow, but no, I found the scenarios kind of calming in a sense because just realizing that longer timeline is there for this adaptation, and that we can, those, like, I love what you said, Karim, to steal your words, like those who can imagine the future have an opportunity right now to do that. And I do really believe that that's true. So, I mean, looking at this new, more hopeful scenario, I would like to think it's not an either or between those two top ones, which is like grassroots and government. And that hasn't been my experience in the last week. Absolutely. I mean, I've been so impressed by our public servants and how they're looking for solutions, but they don't have the solutions, and they need that grassroots organizing in a way that they did not 2-3 months ago. They didn't need to listen in the way that they do now, and that creates an opportunity. And I think, and it's been a really productive and constructive conversation that I've been able to be part of. Yeah, so I think there really is something there. And then the other thing I was just going to add, just to give some data to what Karim was saying around like in the connectivity of small businesses to those big banks. So I think so basically the Save Small Business, we launched a website, 7 businesses launched a website on Sunday. We were very impressed when we had gathered 350 stories by the next morning, and now we're almost at 20,000 stories from small businesses that we've gathered in the last few days. We just did a survey yesterday, and 58% report that they will default either on their April or their May rent. So by May 1st, we'll have 58% of those small businesses defaulting. And one of the questions we asked is, if you did have access to 0 interest unsecured loans, you're not being asked to personally guarantee these, would you take advantage of that to get through this period? And 64% said no. So I do think that is really like going to push that grassroots piece. If the business owners are like, I'm not willing to take on that risk at all, because I can see that business as usual is not going to come back in these next weeks. And I don't know where my business is going to be, and my margins were narrow anyways, so I'm not going to be able to saddle more debt. These deferrals aren't going to work. Then that's just not going to work, and that's going to force new contracts, and that's going to force some of these systems really stress test things. And you know, my hope and why I find this scenario hopeful is because I hope that we can then, something more positive can emerge from that, something more equitable, something more just.
Yeah, and Tammy Lee asked here, you know, and I'd like you to comment on it, Erin, is, you know, that this new social contract is going to require entrepreneurs to build companies and structures that impact as many stakeholders in a positive way as possible. Do you think that that's true in terms of like trying to go as broad as possible, or is focus more important in this? And maybe it's both, I don't know.
I think it's both. I mean, I think we need to have I don't want to see a system that is not, you know, I'm a believer in market capitalism at the end of the day. And, you know, and I do want to see an equitable level playing field in which like the best solutions succeed. I think there's something in that. But the reality is that right now the playing field has been tilted like dramatically away from so many different, you know, whether that's those who are experiencing systemic discrimination in terms of access to capital, or just the ways that we subsidize so much of our economy around our resource-based economy, around our transportation economy. Like we're subsidizing things all over the place. And so, yeah, so I do think we need both to be thinking about what is the cross the board, like we live in a country that does have, we don't live in a completely unregulated country, right? Like we live in a place where there already is a ton of subsidies and regulation and things where the government is creating the economic system in which like our businesses need to function. And let's just acknowledge that and then try to make that system across the board as equitable as possible. And it's going to require some targeted work as well, because there are a number of segments that are just systemically, just inequitably, are just treated inequitably by the system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Now I want to ask the white elephant question, which is the US. Actually, Petra also asked that in the Q&A box. Holy crap. I mean, whatever they do is going to affect us. So can you, if you all, including Erin Williamson, can kind of just riff on that a bit. So Karim, can we start with you in terms of US responses and how are we going to deal with that?
Yeah, and we got a bit of a glimpse of one thing, just to be, not to be too dystopic about it, but you know, what is the probability of some form of breakdown in social cohesion in some parts of the United States as a result of this? Because we are in an unsustainable situation, and some cities are getting hit pretty hard. Obviously, New York City. But what happens when? And it's not necessarily. It's partially the economic choices, but it's also the health choices that have to be made. That could really result in some very dramatic things that have to happen there to preserve some sense of social order, and that's really concerning. That ought to be really concerning as a Canadian. So I think there's the security side. We've never, since the Fenian raids, we have not had to worry about that in any real way. And the Fenian raids, which is before our country was formed as a country. And then clearly the economic relationship, which is going to evolve dramatically. One of the things that some people are predicting is, is the new world here one where we just trade less? Because for a variety of national resiliency reasons, we need to produce more of the things that we need here. And if that's the case, that'll change the relationship as well. And you know, Canada would generally still be a high cost jurisdiction for production, and so that could be if Canada trades less, Canada's likely to be less wealthy. And whether wealth is the thing we need, of course, there are the zero growth people, or the people who think that we're going to enter a new phase where we're going to consume less anyway. We're going to figure out new ways of being in community that are more healthy and less resource dependent. I don't know if that'll be the case. I think there is a minority of people who definitely want that to be the case, and I think a larger plurality of people who are experiencing that now and trying to figure things out. So those would be comments on the U.S. situation. There's a security side and an economic side.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, like, is the notion of degrowth even something that policymakers are entertaining with any seriousness?
Not really. That remains a really marginal idea. Some of the ideas around basic income or guaranteed income have entered the mainstream, and our government was one of the key players in Canada. That the Kathleen Wynne government was a key player in bringing that into the mainstream by running an experiment in 3 communities in Ontario. I'll just say something here that is it's more of a political point, but something worth mentioning. and I've been trying to caution a bit of this in a few places, and I see other people, Gwyn Dyer apparently wrote about this recently, to really caution against policy triumphalism, i.e., this situation is showing the thing I believe to be even more true. Online education. I've been calling for online education for years, and that's showing this to be true. I've been calling for, this shows why we need climate action, because it's actually good. People who are, it's a natural impulse to say, yes, this is showing that I'm right, but just people are suffering right now. And so we have to be very supple about, for the people who are championing ideas, people have to, there's a need, I think, to be a bit supple around it. And do the work that you need to do to show the merit of the idea, and then on the other, and start to make those arguments. But just be a bit careful about it, because there will be a backlash because there people are suffering now.
I wanted to put a question to Sue on this too, because I think there's another dimension to the US question, which Sue, you mentioned yesterday, because part of the purpose of this conversation is around what are the known knowns, like how do I start to plan for this? And on this time dimension for what happens in Canada, let's say we do everything right and we really nail this, but you made a point yesterday around, okay, even if we manage it effectively in Canada, what does it mean that they're doing what they're doing in the States?
Well, we presume that we're managing it well in Canada. This is a disruptive technology, and a lot of things are going to change on both sides of the border. And I think I agree with what Karim said, that things that have wanted to move for a long time are going to go boof. We've seen changes in the Canadian healthcare system quite rapidly, accelerating, speaking to your doctor by telephone instead of face-to-face, all kinds of things. So change that was waiting to happen is moving really rapidly. So you can take advantage of that, but you can move in the wrong direction, or re-concretize things that are the wrong move. It's if the United States remains having, it's like a number of different nations, and it's going to have very hard hit cities and local disruption of the healthcare system and the economy, and it's going to continue for some time. And so we'll have to have a porous border to a certain extent, because we do not have a completely self-sufficient economy. So food will have to flow up from California, and products will have to flow down from Canada. So, to keep the population fed is part of getting the population through a pandemic. So there's going to be some cross trade, and there's going to be some reimportation of infection and movement. And so that's going to make it difficult to solve. What it's going to mean for the discussion about healthcare systems on both sides of the border is going to be fascinating to watch in unpredictable ways. The US is going to experience great social inequity in terms of health coverage. They have a population that has more elite private health care and populations without. And what this disruptive technology does to that political discourse, I don't even want to hazard a guess, because that's not really my primary field, but the health systems people will be watching this very carefully. And I do think that we're going to see some at least localized deep disruption in the States, and some deep disruption and localized in Canada as well, with the healthcare crisis.
Erin, what about you in terms of like how you think about the markets that you're now serving? I mean, you kind of pivoted to very local news, so in a weird way, you're well positioned. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. I'm glad you're not asking me to talk about the States, because part of my mental health strategy is to try to not pay attention. I'll catch up, I'm sure, but I just, it's too much. So basically my company, I'll tell you just a little bit about the story of my company and how we're thinking about things, is a digital news media company. And we, now 2 years ago, I guess, we started by wanting to saw an opportunity for doing more in-depth investigative journalism that was more responsive to community need for information, as opposed to the typical system, which is more responsive to like a political cycle or whatever the PR is. And, we've seen the decline of news pretty consistently over the last 10 years. As the advertising-based business model has been disrupted by Google and Facebook. And so it was about 2 years ago that we made a pivot in terms of thinking about our market strategy to being very, very local. And And part of that was because we realized where we were seeing the fastest decline with in news media was specifically at the local level in smaller markets. And meantime, in all of our testing, like we're all about having audience-based revenue be the primary source of revenue. And part of that is because we want to see our business model really aligning, incentivizing the journalists to directly support people rather than directly be more accountable to advertisers or other sorts of business models. So that felt like the cleanest business model. Not perfect, but better than the alternative. So when we were seeing in all of our testing was that that was also that people were more likely to pay for journalism, in-depth journalism in local, because it mattered within their local community than they were to pay for that work nationally. When it was an issue that mattered to them, but it wasn't necessarily happening within their own community. So that was part of our strategy. And so, you know, we're a startup, we're raising capital and all that kind of stuff to be able to grow this, and have had a number of challenges raising capital that I won't bore you with. But we had a major setback as a result of something that felt like this left field unpredictable thing that disrupted our seed round, I guess now 18 months ago, something like that, which basically I had to lay off a whole bunch of people. It basically interrupted our business for about we were insolvent for like about 2 months, and we managed to adapt. And so one of the reasons I'm feeling kind of at home in this current circumstance is because we just went through that 18 months ago and found a way to adapt and become a more flexible organization. One of the things that we did was stop thinking about you know, if our goal is to build local media outlets and this community-powered model of journalism that's working, and to like see that coming up in many, many different communities, you know, we'd like to see this in hundreds of communities across Canada. What we had been doing is like, oh, well, the method for that is I raise money and then I start another community and I hire those journalists and I do it that way. Then I raise money again and I hire another journalist. And that was just like way too slow and, you know, involved, it was just way more capital intensive. So when we went through this period, one of the things that we thought about was, okay, how can we have the impact that we want to have? How can we create the value that we want to create in a way that isn't necessarily as capital intensive, and is scrappier, is faster, is leaner, and made this pivot towards thinking about, okay, well, actually, there's a lot of journalists out there in communities right now that have been laid off, who want to be doing work, who are connected to their local communities. They don't need a job. They don't necessarily want to work for me. I don't want to be the Paul Godfrey of the future. Instead, how can we create the supports for them and then monetize that in a way that is creative? And so we've basically come up with what, Anna, you use the word equitable franchise model, but basically ways to try to empower other people to do things. So we've been able to grow a lot faster. We're now in 8 communities since we made this pivot in January, and we're about to launch in 3 new communities this week. In the meantime, this huge economic crisis, it hasn't changed anything for media, but it's like quickly accelerated the collapse of local news. And so we're just really trying to, we're in such a better position to rise to that opportunity because we're so much leaner and scrappier. And so, yeah, we're seeing local newspapers failing across the country. Like yesterday, there was another few that were announced. And anyhow, so I think we're going to see a lot of that, like the trend, there's no new trends in media, but the acceleration of the existing trends and sort of what needs to happen in the transition, I think is going to happen really quickly. And so we're just hoping that we're just trying to think, how can we add as much value to that transition as possible?
Yeah, which is kind of what Sue was referring to in terms of there are things that were already on the go in terms of the types of changes we want society to be involved in, and then it's going to accelerate. And we just have to make sure the good ones are the ones that get accelerated, not the bad sort of behaviors. I love the phrase policy triumphalism, Karim. I think that's really good. There's a bit of an offbeat question here, but I think if Sue, if you can answer this, from Caitlin Tomaselli, who says, farmers, are they the new hotbed for distribution of the virus come harvesting season?
A little out of my area of expertise, but I'll jump in. We do know that in Canada, we do use migrant farm workers from Latin America, from the States, to harvest vegetables. So the Essex County area, for example, has a lot of migrant workers. And I don't know, I would caution people against being xenophobic about them coming in to do important work. It may be that other people do that work if there's restricted movement. I think that right now we're looking at people who traveled for all different reasons and not necessarily put the finger on people who are doing one part of the economy a favor. So if there's transportation of produce and people in trucks, we'll have to be very cautious about that. So movement is movement. Movement means more social contact, and we have to be cautious. But putting a finger on it, blaming one industry is going to be very dangerous because we will have to eat. Did that answer your question? If not, then fire it at me again.
Great. So we only have 10 minutes left. So in the last remaining 10 minutes, for participants who have been so great at staying with us, post your questions on the Q&A box. But then I think maybe what we can do is turn the conversation now into, the three things that, if you all agree that the scenario is something that kind of makes sense to you, what are the three things you would give this group of now over 80 participants in this call, sort of advice or insights in the way they might want to start moving in the next little while? And just to give you a sense of who these people are, as I said, most of these participants are either business owners or content creators or people working in the arts and culture industry, and certainly in the digital media space, and a lot of freelancers as well. So do you want to start, Karim? Okay.
Yeah, and I put one of my blog posts up on the chat, and maybe I'll put the other one up because I had kind of a bit of advice there, like, I'm sure things that people on this call are doing anyway, but it was I wrote this fairly early on. Connect with your people, your team, connect with your constituents, and then let your people and your process go. The things that you were wedded to start to let go. So that's one piece. I would say, echoing some of the earlier comments, this is really a great opportunity for collective action. And lots of entities are doing what CFC is doing in terms of running webinars and media and video meetings. And I would recommend that, frankly, to anyone who's got a constituency, because you never know who's going to find you if you put your thing out there. And you can, at a time when some people are at home and others are looking for meaning and others are looking for new community, new opportunity online. I would say one thing about in the creator space, it's really remarkable that at a time when, as referred to earlier, some financial institutions are not giving anything away and except waiting to be paid for things. But so many creators are giving away their content right now. And so one thing that I would flag or warn is that the creation is so important, and there needs to be an economy around creation. And so I think the community of creators, as they're doing the things that are their natural impulse, which is to give, to create and then to offer their creation, I would really strongly recommend, even in this period of crisis, some form of conversation internally in different parts of the creator community around what our revenues are going to look like. And Erin's made a reference to what she's doing, and there's just going to be a real need to attach people to payment for creation. That is always going to be required, and that's just a conversation I think needs to happen.
Great, thanks, Karim. Erin?
Which Erin?
Oh, sorry, Erin Williamson. Why don't I go with you?
All right, I guess my last words out of this are, first of all, I think going through this process of developing these has been a process for me as well. None of these are answers that I wanted. I think the thing that I've found most paralyzing is not really knowing what's going to happen. And so for me, really grounding myself in kind of probability and grounding myself in what I think is most likely to happen is allowing me get over the first stage of denial and kind of figure out, okay, so where do I need to go from here? And I think I would encourage everyone on here we can supply some of the background documents and thinking under this if there's kind of a difficulty in accepting some of the time frames and things that are on here. But I think as a next step for everyone, I think it's important to kind of look at these time frames and think for yourself, for your business. What is your plan for 6 months? What is your plan for 12 months? What is your plan for 24 months? And really seriously put yourself into that task, because I think the uncertainty is a real liability in this situation, and being able to kind of spring from what you think is most likely happen and go into actually planning that. A lot of people have, say, things that have been in the works for summer, or things that are coming into play in the fall, really being realistic and not just saying, well, that's far in the future, we can't know that. I think really getting ahead of that curve is going to be critical. And I think that is also applies to advocacy and kind of leaning into the kind of policies that we want to see emerge, because I worry with big stimulus packages, like when we see a $2 trillion stimulus package come out, if all of the measures of that $2 trillion are short term and it's all about kind of short term mitigation, are we keeping the powder dry and kind of focusing our efforts on things that are going to bear fruit in the long term? And this goes for even as a business owner, piling on debt and deferrals. If you're kind of trying to pile on debt to maintain the status quo that no longer exists, is that the right move to make at this point? So I think that's what I.
Great. Sue, final thoughts. And also Allison asked, is there going to be any Canadian-based modeling of this stuff, and when will it be available?
Yeah, very soon. There is a lot of modeling being done right now out of my university, University of Toronto, Dalla, Lana School of Public Health, and other universities and other, trust me, it will have new spin. Public Health Ontario, Public Health Agency of Canada are two agencies that have fantastic websites that update the world literature on COVID rapidly. And I think that you will see the forecasters have been doing work furiously, consulting with public health insiders on a real live basis, trying to respond to their immediate needs. And the scientific journals will try to push this information out through peer review as rapidly as it can be done.
Great. And what are your 3 things, Sue, in terms of what people ought to be thinking of?
There's an opportunity here. There's an opportunity to do good work for the economy and at the same time do good work for society. There are social needs that need disruption, that need a new way of thinking. And I think that people, there's an opportunity to respond. I don't know how many that counts as, but that's my message.
Great. Thank you. And Erin?
Yeah, I'm going to get super tactical, if that's all right.
Yes.
Specifically speak, this is for everyone, but specifically speak to the women founders, because I've been hearing a lot from women founders that I think we need to remember. I think the big thing out of these scenarios is don't think about 2 months. Think about how you can build your organization to be resilient within these 2 months for the long haul. And that means making some really hard decisions. So one thing I keep hearing more from women than men as we're seeing the economic aid things being rolled out is, I don't exactly need that yet. And so I have an obligation not to take advantage of that financial opportunity. I really believe that you should take advantage of everything that you can to build your cash reserves and extend your runway. And because your obligation right now as a business owner to society, in my view, is not to, your obligation is not to put the least amount of burden on the system. In my view, your obligation is to make your organization as strong as possible so that you're there to fuel the next, the economy into the future. And that also means making some hard decisions about cost structure, specifically as it relates to labor. we need to be thinking, I think these scenarios gives us an opportunity to really lean into trying to imagine what this new economic norm is going to be like. And some of your employees are likely not relevant in that new economic environment because your business models are going to change. And it feels terrible to let people go, but now is actually an okay time to do that because the social safety net is there to catch these people. And again, your obligation is to strengthen your organization as much as possible. So those are a couple of things that I would say. And also just like ask for, like, to Karim's point, like, let's not give our work away for free right now. There is money out there. There's a lot of people who do have financial security. One of the things, so we were in the middle of a campaign in the Discourse couch, and we were in the middle of an audience revenue campaign when this stuff really blew up that was on a totally different topic. And it felt super weird to finish that campaign and send out the final email saying like, hey, give us your money when all of this stuff was happening. And so we just acknowledged that in the final emails and we said, hey, it feels weird to be asking you for money right now about this, but actually this campaign is about the things that matter right now. It's about connecting our community. It's about storytelling, all of those stuff. So we're gonna follow through on this and we still want this campaign to succeed. And we quadrupled our what our target was for the money that people gave to us during that period of time. People are looking for an outlet to use their economic power to contribute to things that create real value. And so I would just say, like, don't stop trying to monetize your work because you feel like everybody is hurting. You're probably hurting more than a lot of people are and a lot of your customers are. And yeah, and then I would just say my final point, and then I'll shut up, I promise, is like, do everything you can to lower your fixed costs and build your cash reserves. Get out of whatever you can so that, get rid of your office if you can. If you're in a co-working space, like whatever you need to do, just like get rid of fixed expenses and build cash reserves. And then find your people, like join your community, whether that's this community or the Fifth Wave community or another. If you want to be updated from the things that we're doing with Save Small Business, you can go and join that list by signing the petition, and we'll keep you updated. But we're going to need to be connected as communities to be able to take some of the opportunities for collective action that we're going to need to build this new society and economy.
Well, thank you so much, Karim, Erin, Sue. Erin and I will continue to work on this stuff, the Williamson, to do this. Now, before everyone goes, Suzanne Stein's also one of the participants, and we're hoping to do a follow-up webinar with Suze from OCAD-U University and Erin and myself around how we get to that new social contract. What are the values drivers that will enable us to get there? So stay tuned for that next webinar. If you have any questions or any ideas of what you want more of, can you just write it in the Q&A box and say, I'd really love a webinar on this. I really need this. I really need that. And if you want part 2 of this because you need more time to dig in and make that be a little bit more open, where it's not a webinar but an actual Zoom conversation, do state that in the Q&A as well. And we are hoping to be able to answer almost all of those questions in whatever manner we can. I'd like to give big thanks to Natalie, Joseph, and Zella, VC, and Jeannie and the gang. They're behind the scenes making this all work. And thank you so much for joining us. Wash your hands. Wash your hands. Do not touch your face. We were all very good. None of us touched our face at this webinar. I've been in many webinars and everyone was touching their face. And we'll see you hopefully next week. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Erin. Thank you, Erin and Sue.
Thank you.
And Natalie.